Yes, it's interesting that having lived throughout my life that neighborhoods, how much neighborhoods don't change on the south and west sides. I mean, you've got gentrification. I also find it interesting that they call it regentrification. It's sort of redundant, right? As if the neighborhoods weren't gentrified to begin with, right? It's interesting how little neighborhoods change from the fact that they are identified culturally. I mean, even though you take a place like Little Village that was predominantly Polish and is now predominantly Hispanic, it's still Little Village. It's still a village. People live and go to high school and buy their groceries there, and they may have to leave the neighborhood to work, which is a newer issue now. Whereas 30 or 40 years ago, the neighborhoods were self-sustaining. You had your manufacturing, your small grade manufacturing, you had your banks and your stores and your retail and everything in the neighborhood. And you had people that spent their whole lives never moving out of the neighborhood. In fact, I worked with a woman, my first job, I worked with a woman who had lived, she was middle-aged, maybe about 50. And her first trip downtown was to go to work. And she had just started working a few years earlier, and was in her 50s, so had never ever. She was from South Chicago, but she never had any reason to come downtown because there was a retail section on Commercial. People worked in the steel mills, or in some small manufacturing. The high schools were there, the grade schools. There was no reason to leave. So, and that's what I always find interesting about Chicago is that for the longest time, when manufacturing was so significant in this country, that Chicago had the ability, politically I guess, to maintain this culturally polarized nature, right? Mm-hmm. And celebrates it now with these entryways or these identifiers, like in Pilsen you have these Aztec sewer covers, or not sewer covers, but they're like street markers. They're about 2 feet in diameter, and they're on each corner on, I think it's going down 18th Street. And in Chinatown, you've got the big, Chinese gate, and in Little Village, you have the village gate, and in Humboldt, you've got the big flag, either at a division, and those still really identify those neighborhoods. I mean, because even though Humboldt has been gentrified to a certain extent, it's still very Puerto Rican. I mean, the parade still goes through there, the festival's still in Humboldt Park after all these years, and still there's like 1 million Puerto Ricans hanging out windows and on tree branches. I mean, it's amazing to watch. If you ever go, it's amazing to have to be there during the weekend of Puerto Rican independence, because you'd never guess there were that many Puerto Ricans in Chicago, and they're just like, it's so cool. It's so neat to see though, but it's the same thing about Little Village. You've got Mexican independence. That's the second largest parade in Chicago behind St. Patrick's Day. Yeah, and it's always been because since the 60s then we had like 500,000 Mexicans in Chicago. We had the second largest population of Mexicans outside of LA, and we have continued to have that. So yeah, there's a lot. I mean, and now it goes. Then there was 18th Street. There was back of the yards. There was Little Village, which was the suburbs. When you moved out of Pilsen, you moved to the suburbs, which was Little Village. So went from 18. You went 8 blocks? Yeah, 8 blocks, right? And that was the suburbs.